I welcome the release today of the IPCA's report into the policing of the Parliament protest. I'm pleased that the review found the public was well served by police throughout the course of the protest and that the tactics we adopted were justified. On the final day, frontline officers faced extreme provocation and violent behaviour from some of the protesters, and we saw a level of disorder and violence rarely seen in New Zealand. The report noted that our staff were remarkably professional and restrained in the face of this provocation, and I wholeheartedly agree. I'm immensely proud of the work our people did through the course of this protest. It was an unprecedented event and one of the most significant policing challenges in decades. The areas for improvement identified by the IPCA align with police's own internal reviews after the protest, and many of those actions are already well underway. I want to reiterate that I'm pleased the report reflected favourably on police's overall performance, which reflects the incredible work by hundreds of police staff over the 3 weeks of the occupation. The way our people turned out on the day reflects the character of the police service we are fortunate to have in this country. I'm happy to take any questions you have.
Do you accept all findings and recommendations, and do you apologise to the public for any of the failings?
We've accepted the recommendations and they do align with what we have, I suppose, identified through our own internal reviews. I don't think that there's any call there for an apology. We're very proud of how we turned out for this event.
What's the biggest lesson?
Look, this was an incredibly dynamic event and one unlike others we had encountered in the past. So taking a single lesson is difficult. Every event will be different. But there are many things that we can improve, and we're focused on doing that off the back of the IPCA's recommendations.
I guess the overall theme of the IPCA report, apart from welcoming, saying that overall the police did well, as they point out, their job is to look for shortcomings so improvements can be made. And there's a theme of underestimating risk in the first place, not adequate planning, and under-resourcing. Do you accept that general criticism?
Yeah, I mean, this was the biggest event we had seen of this kind in 40 years. So in hindsight, we can easily say we underestimated. However, when we compare it to what had occurred in the preceding decades, this was an outlier, and that will always be a real challenge to predict.
Commissioner, you had 23 days from woe to go to plan for this. Why are there still so many flaws?
I don't think it's accurate to say there were 23 days to plan. This changed on a daily basis, and I think it's hard to understand, reading a report with full hindsight, just how dynamic this situation was. Every day was different, and every day we had to assess where we were and what the right tactics were. I'm incredibly proud of the way our team was able to plan for a resolution given how fast the events were changing.
In terms of the traffic management plan, why was there not one in place beforehand, and could you have prevented the occupation altogether if you had one?
I think we accept the finding from the authority that a traffic management plan should have been a consideration. However, when I look at what the intelligence was saying, and if we looked at international events, the threat was towards critical infrastructure. And so if we'd had a traffic management plan, it wouldn't have been to protect Parliament or the streets around Parliament, it would have been to protect the terrace tunnel, the ferry, the motorway, and so I don't believe that a traffic management plan would have made any difference.
Are you concerned that there were something like 2,000 complaints laid against police during the protest?
As I understand it, the balance between the complaints, between those who felt that police did too much, shouldn't have intervened, and those who felt that police didn't do enough. And I think that reflects the polarisation that existed in the community at that time and over this event. I'm really pleased with how we responded, and I think with the full benefit of hindsight and this report, the public can see the police did a good job.
I think the IPCA found that there were 8 police actions unjustified. Has that resulted in any disciplinary action against any officers?
Firstly, to note, 8 actions over the thousands of interactions that occurred over those weeks is remarkable in itself. In terms of those ones, as the judges said this morning, there will be a report from the IPCA to police when they finalise those instances, and we'll be able to consider what action, if any, may be taken.
Do you accept that poor decisions from the management put officers in harm's way? Several officers ended up in hospital.
Look, it's very clear that at the conclusion of the protest we had insufficient equipment for the violence that we encountered. That was foreseen in the planning for the operation, and there were efforts made to secure equipment from across police's partners and across the country. The reality is we did not have enough equipment in the country for the scale of what occurred. In hindsight, that's clear. We have since purchased additional equipment to create a larger centralised store for that kind of event.
These events were occurring elsewhere too, in the Netherlands and the States and so on, to similar degrees. Why did police not have any foreplanning?
Yeah, the events across the world were quite varied and different, and we certainly had explored whether we needed additional equipment in the period before the protest eventuated. In hindsight, the position where we landed on that was not the right one, and we accept the finding there.
Just off the back of that other question, sending these officers in without proper protection equipment, was that putting them needlessly at risk?
Doing nothing here was not an option. When bad things are happening, it's police's role to stand up and respond and deal with the situation. And it's an unfortunate reality and reflects the courage of our people that every day we go in harm's way to keep the public safe. This was a situation where we had to act.
In terms of the extra equipment, you talked about getting more resources. The IPCA specifically mentions body armour as an urgent need.
So we've purchased 150 additional sets of hard armour for a centralised store, and then across our regional supplies we've also reviewed those. We may increase that further, but we've taken immediate action to respond to that.
The IPCA also talks about the decision to deploy body armour and says that perhaps there could be more flexibility for officers in the field to decide when it was necessary, and one officer talked about a perception that the police didn't want to be seen to be unduly militaristic or provocative in their appearance. How much of an error of judgment was that?
Yeah, it's a really important question about when you move from a human face to an armoured face, if you like. And through the course of the protest, we'd had particular reaction from the crowd when we used shields to place concrete bollards and so on. So we know that anything, even protective equipment on police, can be seen as an escalation, and that's a staff safety issue. So this isn't a, wear it and you're safe, don't wear it and you're not. It is one that has to be balanced through the whole course of the decision making.
So as a result of this incident, how would you say the policy may or may not change for the next event?
I think the reflection that's really helpful in the review is the idea of having pre-agreed thresholds, so that if this occurs, then the permission for use of hard armour, for example, will be this. So that's a thing for planning future operations that we'll take into account.
In terms of the arrests made, is it disappointing so many had to be dropped because they weren't processed properly?
Yeah, look, I think there were a lot of things that came out of the action on the 10th of February that we can learn from. It really turns around mass arrest processes. In the end, prosecution of the few of a large crowd that were arrested was probably not the biggest outcome. The big outcome was resolving this as safely as we could.
Yeah, what were some of those learnings, I guess, if this was to happen again?
We moved at some pace to mobilise an operation on the 10th of February, and that was in response to a rapidly growing occupation and our desire, as soon as we had lawful justification, to try and resolve it and shut it down. Now, we could not mobilise enough staff to do that at that time, and that's why we took the time that we did to bring the final resolution.
And in terms of mobilising those staff, it said in the report that newly graduated officers who were used to burst numbers for the operation had not been adequately prepared or equipped for a role in the operation. Was that fair to put them in that position?
Those are decisions we don't take lightly. We know that staff fresh out of college haven't had the opportunity for being exposed in a more gentle way to frontline policing. At this time, we were in the midst of a COVID outbreak, and our staffing numbers were dropping rapidly across the country as a result of sickness. We had a small window in which to act, and part of that, unfortunately, was the need to mobilise less experienced staff.
So you mentioned the more resources being purchased, reviewing the public order policing. What about training? Any changes there for staff?
Yeah, so there's, I suppose, the question about what is the appropriate level of public order training for all of our frontline staff, and then a smaller group of specialists to deploy with specialist equipment. We are doing a full review of public order policing, and training will be a key consideration there.
Because of what happened to your officers during that period. Did any subsequently resign because of it? And what's it doing for recruiting, you think?
I'm not aware that officers have resigned as a consequence. The staff that I spoke to, even those who were injured, were incredibly proud of police's actions on the day and to have been part of an historic event in our history. In terms of our recruiting, we remain in a good place. In contrast to Australian colleagues who are struggling to keep numbers even at a minimum, we are still successfully growing through this period. So I think people were very proud of the police service they saw on that last day, and our applications to join went up significantly in the weeks following.
When is that review of public order policing set to be completed?
Will take as long as we need to. We've put in place a range of mitigations already, but I expect that it'll be in the next 3 to 6 months that we get to a final policy and arrangements.
One of the issues that the IPCA talks about is intelligence gathering and how the police gathered intelligence beforehand. What are you hearing about the level of activity or concern in the community generally from the sort of people who gathered in Wellington, they were likely to do it again?
Yeah, it's a fascinating area. There are hundreds of protests that occur across the country every year. Many of those, 100 people will show interest in attending and fewer than 10 will turn up. And so it's needle in the haystack stuff, and it's working out which ones are the highest risk to deploy to. I think what caught everybody by surprise in terms of what we saw at Parliament was the scale of the people who came and the strength of feeling that they had, and that was really what shaped this protest.
Do you think that strength of feeling is still out there?
I think we're seeing a much more settled environment at the moment. In many ways our community remains very polarised, not just over these issues, over a range of issues, and that's something that all of us have a responsibility to lean into to avoid violent protests playing out as they do.
What would be the one thing you'd want to do differently if you were put in the same position again, leading into Parliament?
I've reflected on that quite a lot, because on the face of it, this was a situation that we'd all have liked to avoid. But actually, I'm incredibly proud of the way we navigated it. I think the report reflects a really positive response from police, and that this was not straightforward. So there's nothing that I'm going to call out to say I would do this differently. Actually, I'm really pleased with how all of our people responded.
You met with the senior members of Cabinet before you and the police took the decision to clear the parliamentary lawn. Did that have any influence on the decision to do it in the manner that it eventuated?
We were providing regular updates to ministers through the course of the protest, and so the final resolution and decision to do that was something we updated them on, but the decision sat with me and the police executive. I think our elected representatives play a really important role, which is to bring the perspective of the public on issues to light, and so those interactions are appropriate, but operational decision making sits with us.
So any encouragement from them to go about that operation more quickly or in a different way?
There was a lot of respect, I think, for police's operational independence. That line is well understood. It's in everyone's interest that we maintain it, and we did in this situation.
I know you said the review is still going on, but if there was next month a huge gathering that caused concern somewhere in the country, what would the public notice that might be different about the police's approach to the next one?
Recency in having dealt with something like this is always helpful because the learnings are fresh, people are able to apply them, and so I'm really confident that we would hit the ground running, if you like, in terms of a situation like this. The risk actually comes where, over time, it seems less and less likely that something like this could happen, and maintaining that high level of readiness that you need. And so that's where my focus would sit for the years beyond.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel to stay up to date with all the latest news from the New Zealand Herald. Click the subscribe button below or check out one of the videos here, and head over to nzherald.co.nz for more details on these stories and more.